Kelsey's recording. Great. We're good to go. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Okay. Cool. Yeah. So we'll get started. Yeah. So thanks so much for joining this session. The title of which is Building Blockchain Solutions for the Enterprise with Truffle. So my name is Kevin Bluer, and you just heard Ben in the background, Ben Burns. And we're both members of the Truffle framework team. Just, I guess, a few logistical things. If you can't hear, or if there's an issue with seeing the screen or audio, just feel free to shout in the chat, and we can kind of pause to make sure, try and get it rectified. We'll also talk about how to ask questions and stuff shortly as well, but use the chat for any kind of oddities in terms of audio, video, etc. Cool. So in terms of agenda for today's session, we'll start in a moment with brief bios of Ben and myself. We'll then spend a moment just to look at the goals, what we're going to try and have achieved by the end of this session. We'll then do a quick look at, or introduction or reintroduction for those that are already familiar with this space, to Web 3.0, or the decentralized web as it's sometimes referred to, but in an enterprise context. We'll then spend a bit of time defining and exploring kind of enterprise Ethereum, but we won't just be looking at Ethereum, we'll be looking at other ledgers as well. But given Truffle's predominantly an enterprise, for Ethereum right now, that's kind of going to be the core, but we'll definitely look at others. We'll then spend a bit of time exploring the Truffle suite, and then also Truffle's kind of support for enterprise ledgers or enterprise blockchains. We'll kind of spend the last kind of quarter or a third on a demo, and I've put it in quotes because this is quite a short webinar, that we're kind of keeping it, we've kind of flattened it down to screenshots. I mean, the gist is still, very much there, but just for ease and efficiency on this one, and given it's a bit shorter, we kind of flattened it down. And then we'll close out with next steps for kind of learning more, discovering more, etc., and have a kind of Q&A at the end. On that point about questions, as mentioned, feel free to fire them into the chat. You just heard Jeff in the background there. So he'll be kind of gathering them up. Of course, if it's something to do an issue with audio or video, we'll address it there and then. But if it's questions, if it's a short one, we may answer it in line during the session. Otherwise, we'll kind of park them all for the end, and they're kind of more deeper dive there.
Sounds great, Kevin. Also, just one quick note, Kevin. We're not going to do a poll, but we will send out a survey at the end. And as Kevin said, we're recording, and we'll send out the deck as well. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And as Jeff already mentioned it, that little red, ubiquitous red icon at the bottom of this slide, we'll be recording and sharing. So if you have to drop off early or whatever, then we'll share it around for posterity after the fact. Awesome. So very, very, very brief bios on Ben and myself. So myself, Kevin Bluer, I'm the head of content and training here at Truffle. I have probably about 15 plus years in software development across many different stacks. About 5 years kind of doing training, also on different stacks. And about 3 to 4 years kind of playing in the blockchain, ledger, Ethereum, etc. Space. So with that, I hand over briefly to Ben to introduce himself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ben Burns. I'm the head of blockchain services at Truffle. I joined Truffle in 2017, and I've worked on a few different areas of the tool suite. Initially, it was GANACHE. It was maintaining GANACHE, but more recently, I focus on enterprise solutions and enterprise product integrations.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Cool. So yeah, in terms of goals for this session, just a few really. The first one is a better appreciation of the kind of disruptive potential, sounds very fancy, of Web 3.0 or the decentralized web, as mentioned, specifically in an enterprise context. Similarly, come away with a kind of better understanding of how blockchains and or decentralized ledgers are benefiting enterprises, both today, and we'll see a few examples, and kind of the future potential as well. And finally, know the role that Truffle and some of the other tools and services that we'll touch on play in the solution kind of development lifecycle. So if you did want to start exploring building something for your company, or if you're consulting for large firms, then how you go about starting and doing that. Kind of quick disclaimer or caveat. This is a pretty introductory session, or a 101 as it's sometimes referred to. We were kind of kicking ourselves after we scheduled this, because we really wish we'd actually asked for people's experience levels on the RSVP form or the registration form, and we didn't. So we don't really, and as always, you're going to get a spectrum of folks and experience levels. So we kind of decided to keep this one pretty intro level. But what we would love, sincerely love, following this, as part of the feedback email, is to see what you'd like to be covered in the future. We'd love to hear what topics, that we cover, and we will truly, base the upcoming, because we're going to be doing a series of these. So that's our plan, maybe once a month. So we'll do it, first and foremost based on feedback. So yeah, definitely reach out and let us know what you'd like to see covered. Cool. So it's kind of stepping back and looking at the bigger picture. And again, this bit's going to be pretty brief. So introduction to Web 3.0, if you're kind of new to this space or new to the paradigm. Very brief history lesson. So Web 1.0, I'm probably going back around 20 odd years now. It's predominantly read-only in terms from a sort of end user perspective of the web. It's pretty low fidelity, so it's mainly text and low-res images. And of course, the overall experience, albeit revolutionary at the time, was relatively simple static sites. Web 2.0, which kind of the era we're still in now, we increasingly saw or have seen the rise of kind of read-write. Again, from an end user perspective, it's trivial to kind of throw content out there. We've seen the rise of user-generated content, kind of the same thing, or user-created content. Richer content types are now kind of the norm, be that user-generated video or streaming audio, etc. And obviously the rise of social media, e-commerce, kind of epitomizes the era we're in. On the kind of grayer or not downside, but just kind of challenges, we've seen a kind of increasing siloing of data. So these large monolithic firms have kind of grown up in this era and hoover up all our data, and it's kind of often gray as to who owns that data, even though in kind of lip service terms it's your data, but is it really? It's pretty gray. And of course, this paradigm's kind of epitomized by centralization. That's kind of been the only way to kind of build these services typically. That brings us to Web 3.0, and again, we're in that kind of transitional state, or it's evolutionary state right now. What we're starting to see here, and some of the potential at least, is kind of more meaningful sovereignty of your data. So where we've got kind of grayness, if it's your health data or identity data stored on third-party kind of centralized infrastructure, now it's technically possible, and obviously arguably somebody would want to have that more greater control over that data, which is arguably your data, and you don't want prying eyes, or you want to know what happens to that data. What we're also seeing is an increasing kind of disintermediation, or the potential for that, wherein like these large monolithic firms, not to bash them, the services they offer, but again, they control a ton of again, your data and these huge services. What we're starting to see is the potential for building and operating these things a little differently, which is very, very exciting. A mediated read-write. So although we had read-write in Web 2.0, if a if a government didn't like it, or some third party didn't like it, it was pretty not straightforward, but it was possible for it to be taken down. In Web 3.0, it's much harder, if not impossible, for content that gets put out there. It's yours. You put it out there, no one can tamper with it. And finally, provenance tracking. So in terms of supply chains, much deeper transparency, kind of the audit trails and so on around these things. And we'll see a kind of example of that in a moment. So in a few quotes, and we kind of dug in while putting this deck together, a few quotes for what Web 3.0 is bringing about. I'm not mentioning names in this first quote, but ride sharing without X, apartment sharing without X, and social media without X and Y, whatever. Obviously, you can fill in the blanks, but you can do all these things, on decentralized infrastructure. Or at least we have the potential to do that. And there's obviously services kind of bubbling up to mimic the same services that we experience, that are centralized but in a decentralized manner, and interesting benefits because of that. Next one, unprecedented visibility and veracity into the sourcing and certification of fresh produce and proteins. So that's kind of putting in context that provenance tracking, so you can actually know, or confidently know from whether it's, and we'll see example, some fish that's been taken out of the ocean and tagged and so on, and that confidently know that it's fished sustainably and so on. And finally, no 404. So that concept of not being able to take down data and so on. And that's there's caveats to that, but it's definitely different to what we've known thus far. Cool. Just a couple more slides on the kind of bigger picture stuff before we get a bit deeper into the the technology itself. So why is this important for enterprise? I think the first line here is the most important one, because it really kind of brings to bear new business models, new ways of doing things, new ways of creating value. And that's super exciting. And if you are an incumbent, working for an incumbent large firm, you want to continually be exploring either new ways of doing business, and or trying to shift the current way in which you're doing business to adapt to those. You don't want to just have the business model that you've always known kind of swept out from underneath you. So it's absolutely important from that perspective. Also, reducing the cost of establishing trust between perhaps semi-trusted or even like zero trusted entities. Again, historically, that's been pretty time-consuming, expensive, very manual. Companies often kind of wrap themselves in legalese, and that's great. If things are working smoothly, all good typically. But of course, if it breaks down, then to kind of work that out, you need to bring in the lawyers, etc. And it's just painful. So again, with some of this technology that we'll again be getting deeper into in a moment, you can see how we'll see how that makes a big difference to the way in which that can be done. And then the kind of final two, obviously, increasing efficiency, accountability, and just generally, from an importance perspective, future-proofing your business. A couple of examples. This is the last two slides before we get a bit more into the kind of meatier technical stuff. JPM coin. I'm sure a good number of you may have heard of this. So this is JP Morgan. They released this coin. It's been controversial because it's not necessarily seen as decentralized, at least yet. In their own words, it's instant transfer of payments between institutional accounts. Really, it's kind of as of right now, at least, it's kind of internal, business unit to business unit, at least as I understand it. So it runs on a private network. We'll be looking at sort of different topologies and so on in a moment. Although what they have stated is that it's going to be subsequently extended to other platforms. So whether that TBD as to whether that means like Ethereum MAINNET or others, we'll see. The reason we called this one out is because it's built on top of something called Quorum, which you may have heard of, which is actually a fork of Ethereum. Created by JPM themselves, kind of really with a bunch of features for support, deeper support of for private or consortium networks. And they've actually added a bunch of new features as well, such as the ability to send private transactions between different parties on the network, something that's not possible on the public mainnet, at least. So yeah, somewhat controversial, and it's caused a lot of buzz. One thing that kind of we think is really interesting with this, and some of the analysis has kind of been put forward about it, is that it's kind of increasingly legitimizing the space. So for which is awesome. If we care about this paradigm in this space, when big folks like this kind of wade in and experiment and do things like this, then that wakes everyone further up to it and further legitimizes it. Another example is World Wildlife Fund, not the World Wrestling Federation, but over in New Zealand, and kind of touched on this in a couple of the quotes and points earlier. So they've partnered with Viant to build a solution to keep illegal, it's a bit of a tongue twister this one, unreported and unregulated fish or seafood out of the supply chain. So really, placing an emphasis on making sure fishing is done sustainably, and sort of from an end user or consumer perspective, if and you can actually, now more feasibly know that the food you're consuming has been caught sustainably, that's important. And now through the technology, we can actually kind of provably see that. So again, they've used Viant's platform, and doing so would have created a smart contract to track the steps, and then a combination of RFID to tag at the point of it being fished, and then as it kind of moves along the supply chain to a restaurant or to your table, I think they use quick response codes to kind of track it, etc. So really, really interesting as a kind of use case. Yeah, this is kind of it in terms of the kind of higher level, fluffier stuff. But if you did want to dive deeper into all the different kind of scenarios and use cases for the enterprise, there's a great article which I'd recommend checking out on ConsenSys' site. Link below, as I don't expect you to write it down right now, but we'll be sharing this deck after the so you can dig in, or of course you can Google it. But it really just breaks down by each industry the challenges they face. Well, thank you for whoever's drawn on that. The challenges they face, and there's some of the potential solutions that this technology can solve. Cool. Okay, so we'll now spend a bit more time kind of defining and exploring kind of enterprise Ethereum and just more broader enterprise ledgers. Before I hand over to Ben, just a kind of quick summary of public Ethereum. And again, I know a lot of you on this call are already building stuff, but this is really for folks that are kind of new to this space. So in Ethereum.org's own words, so Ethereum is the world's first fully programmable blockchain. Essentially, you can build what it's called unstoppable apps, which I think is a really nice term, that run exactly as programmed without any possibility of any downtime, censorship, fraud, or third-party interference. Basically, characteristics that are kind of impossible on centralized, infrastructure or Web 2.0 infrastructure. So, really, really interesting things that it brings, to the table. In terms of numbers, and I won't go through all the bullets here, but it's, it's the most popular blockchain, e.g. 94% of the top 100 blockchain projects are built on top of Ethereum. By the way, I just realized I didn't have my video turned on, and I did intend to, so let me just do that. So you can actually see me. There we go. Cool, sorry about that, and hi, everyone. The other kind of takeaway from this one, before I pass it over to Ben for a moment, is the developer community around this space. And we'll be looking at Truffle and so on in a moment. But there's over 300,000 developers, which is more than any other blockchain maturity. And not that that in and of itself is important, but really just the maturity of the development tools and so on is arguably the most mature out of all of the blockchain. So, sort of interesting stat there. Cool. So with that, I'll pass over to Ben, who's actually going to dive into enterprise Ethereum and broader, this doing this in the enterprise space.
Yeah. So enterprise Ethereum, and I think it's actually most of what I'm about to say also applies to just enterprise distributed ledger technology in general, but Truffle coming from kind of an Ethereum background, we kind of start from there and then work our way out to some of the other DLT technologies. So so as an enterprise, if you look at MAINNET, one of the first things you're going to notice is that the transactional throughput is fairly low. You're in the low tens of transactions per second for total throughput, and the latency is quite high. Our block times are around 12 to 15 seconds. So it's going to take around that amount of time at a minimum to process your transactions. So if you have applications that require low latency or high throughput, that's going to be a bit of a problem for you. So enterprises really need what we call the 3 Ps: privacy, permissioning, and performance. I just mentioned the performance issues, but privacy and permissioning are also pretty major considerations. So privacy on the public chain is effectively nil. You have these kind of pseudonymous addresses that you're operating under, and everybody on the network, the public network, can see all of the state changes in the public network, which, if you're transacting on confidential, sensitive business information, then of course you don't necessarily want the entire world, especially your competitors, to be able to see that. Similarly for permissioning, as a company that's subjected to regulations and contractual concerns and things along those lines, you're likely going to have people in privileged positions, people who have access to information that other people shouldn't have access to, and this is also true of your infrastructure resources as well. So both from a people standpoint and from an infrastructure node standpoint, a network standpoint, being able to specify the permissioning of your network, what resources do these people or these nodes have access to, is also very, very important for a lot of enterprises. So really, enterprise Ethereum and enterprise distributed ledger technology as a whole is concentrated on these 3 Ps. Again, privacy, permissioning, and performance. And also, I think it's worth pointing out on that the main trade-off that we're getting there, that we're driving there, comes from the ConsenSys algorithms. So enterprise Ethereum allows you to swap out different components of your node and your overall protocol, whereas mainnet Ethereum, public Ethereum, really relies on proof of work. It eventually will transition over to proof of stake, but proof of stake is a little ways off yet. So next slide, please. So we talk about public versus enterprise. Actually, I just started talking about this already. Proof of work is definitely the name of the game on public Ethereum, and as I said, that's what's driving the performance there. I mentioned the pseudonymous transactions being not private, the transactional throughput being low, and public validator nodes are recording the entire history of the network. So if you have private information that, you shouldn't be exposing, you certainly don't want it on this indelible public record. And if you have information that's subject to, say, GDPR regulations, where you need to maintain your ability to delete that information after some period of time or upon request, you definitely can't store any of that information that's subject to those regulations on a public chain. In fact, you might not be able to store them on a private chain either. So with Enterprise Ethereum, though, as I mentioned, you can customize the ConsenSys algorithm, which allows you to trade between performance and the level of trust that you have for your counterparties. So if you're operating in a business context where you have a decent legal framework in place and you can trust in your legal framework, then maybe your counterparty risk is somewhat mitigated by that, and you're in a better position to use an enterprise ledger that has a ConsenSys algorithm that's more favorable to your performance needs, but sacrifices a little bit of that Byzantine fault tolerance. So yeah, so you get a lot of performance out of that. You can also very, very carefully control which nodes in the network are allowed to validate blocks. In other words, which nodes are allowed to approve transactions. So that's part of the permissioning aspect. You can get pretty high throughputs. So we've seen demonstrations up to the thousands of transactions per second. I think by the end of this year, so we've seen some early technology demonstrations that are pushing like the 10,000 transaction per second range. So I think there's a lot of really exciting things happening in the performance space in enterprise ledger technology as a whole. So definitely, the upper bound of performance is a little bit squishy at the moment, and the envelope is expanding very rapidly. And then finally, there's all kinds of different solutions out there for having private transactions between, the range of that is like in some networks, you can see that transactions have occurred, but you can't see the contents or the state changes of those transactions. In other networks, you can basically have transactions that are 100% confidential, and only the counterparties that you're transacting with can see the transactions in question. And then, of course, finally, there's a hybrid model as well, where you're operating part of your application on an enterprise blockchain and part of your application on the public blockchain. And there's a pretty big spectrum of options there. But part of what you might see there is pegging information back to the public chain, so that there's an indelible record of some snapshot of your state at some point in time. But then all of the actual state is kept private on your enterprise chain. Next slide, please. So as an enterprise, you're likely looking at blockchain technology on the whole and thinking to yourself, okay, well, what is it really good for? How do I know if it's a good fit for my needs? And this image is a decision tree. I apologize, it's a little bit small, the text, but it kind of walks you through the decision process behind whether or not you should use a blockchain, whether or not a blockchain is a good fit for your needs. So the way I like to think about it is, if you have an asset that is intangible, so let's say licensing or access to some kind of digital resource or warranties or anything like that, that's usually a great fit for a blockchain. Anything transferable like that especially is a great fit. If you're going into the physical realm and you're doing things like supply chain tracking and that sort of stuff, it's still a great fit, but you're likely going to have some real world solution necessary to actually enable that tracking. So it's not the blockchain by itself is a key enabler, but there's other components of the technology stack. So some things to consider from this decision tree, basically the type of asset you're working with. Is it digital or physical? Are you trying to remove different intermediaries or brokers? Can you create a permanent or authoritative record of the digital asset in question? Do you require high performance or rapid transactions, especially transactions that need to complete with low latency in like the millisecond time range? Do you need to store large amounts of information, especially non-transactional information, as part of your solution? And does that information need to be modifiable or mutable? Do you need to be able to update that information, or does it need to be, is it okay if it's static? Do you want or need to rely on some trusted third party? Are you managing contractual relationships or some kind of value exchange? Or do you require shared write access? Do contributors know and trust each other, and are contributors' interests unified or well aligned? So that one's actually really interesting. You know, if your contributor interests are unified or well aligned, you might not really need a blockchain, because you can trust your counterparties. But if you need to be able to control functionality tightly, and there's some well-defined business process you're automating, then again, being able to model that on a blockchain is still, even in the context of having a really highly trusted business partner, being able to model those business processes on a blockchain is highly advantageous. So it's interesting when you look at all these different interactions, and the decision of whether or not a blockchain is a good fit isn't always super clear right from the outset. But it's these are the types of things you want to be listening to, or you want to be looking at. Next slide. So this image here is a little bit much to take in all at once, but I'll kind of walk you through it. Basically, this is the architecture stack for an enterprise Ethereum application. But if you think about it in terms of enterprise distributed ledger applications as well, I think it's still a pretty good fit. So down on the left column there, you've got, from top to bottom, you've got different layers of the stack, from the application layer all the way on down through to the network protocol layer, the lowest layer of the stack. And the things in yellow and green are pieces that are already provided by public blockchains, or public Ethereum in this case. And the kind of lilac purple portions are portions that are more left up to enterprise blockchains to provide. So, when you look all the way down at the network protocol stack, Dev P2P is something that's a piece of the protocol that's used to basically gossip around the existence of blocks and transactions, so that the entire network can learn when a new event has taken place. So there's a new transaction and there's a new block. Well, in an enterprise context, you may want to have an enterprise peer-to-peer protocol that adds a layer of authentication and permissioning, so that blocks from trusted resources are the only blocks that are accepted. Similarly, in the core blockchain, you have on-chain private state, trusted execution, and private consensus. These are all things that really only apply to the enterprise context. And so the enterprise Ethereum world and the enterprise distributed ledger world at large is kind of looking more at these areas than it is at the areas that public Ethereum and public blockchains are really serving quite well. I think I'll probably leave this there. There's more we could talk to here, but in the interest of time, I think this is probably good enough. Yeah, and so finally, you're going to be looking at this thinking like, okay, this is all well and good, but just how do I get started, right? So apart from the Truffle tool suite, which Kevin will show you through in just a minute, if you get to the point where you've got your application coded up and you want to actually deploy it someplace, you're going to need a network to deploy it to, an enterprise network to deploy it to. So there's all kinds of great options out there. As far as hosted options go, the ones that we're well familiar with are Azure Blockchain, Kaleido, and AWS. Azure Blockchain and AWS are obviously Azure and AWS are big cloud providers. And if you're already using those cloud providers, these can be great options for you. They both have their own managed blockchain solutions that are quite interesting and quite feature rich. Kaleido is an interesting one. Kaleido, if you aren't familiar with them, they give you a really nice kind of almost point and click, very rapid blockchain creation process. If you're familiar with like Heroku or any of those, they focus on a similar sort of user experience where basically you're up and running in the course of a couple of minutes. So Kaleido is one that I highly recommend if you don't already have an existing cloud provider and you just want to get up and running with let's say a development network or staging or even a production network really rapidly.
Awesome.
And that's it for me.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that, Ben. So as Ben kind of mentioned there, that last slide was kind of assuming you were ready to start either pushing up some stuff to test with other parties, etc. What we'll look at now is the Truffle suite, which is kind of everything you would do prior to that, to actually build locally, test locally, etc. And then obviously from Truffle itself, or through Truffle itself, you can actually migrate to these the enterprise networks and so on. Again, some of you are going to be familiar with this. So this is, so in our own words, Truffle is a world-class development environment, testing framework, and asset pipeline for Ethereum. Put an asterisk there, or caveat, just because we are, as we'll be seeing a little more later, supporting additional blockchains, ledgers, etc. Overall, aiming to make life as an Ethereum developer, or your life as an Ethereum developer, easier. In this little graphic in the middle, from left to right, we've got these are just the funky little logos we have for each of the respective products in the suite. So Truffle on the left, GANACHE in the middle, and DRIZZLE on the right, and we'll go through those now. So starting with Truffle, this is Truffle Suite still. We'll segue into Truffle in a moment, but so at the Truffle Suite level, it's comprised of a range of different tools and components. I've put part of the impact stack. That's not really, I don't think, a widely circulated acronym yet, although it's starting to bubble out there a little bit. We'll elaborate or unfurl that later, but the Truffle is the T in that stack. So, and the kind of takeaway from the point about it later is these are interesting technologies to explore, just to get closer to the the kind of pieces in the puzzle if you were going to really start going all in and building kind of enterprise solutions on it. And the K there in it is actually Kaleido as well. Truffle itself is 100% free and open source software, hosted on GitHub at github.com/Truffle Suite. As of last week, and this is just Truffle, and we'll see the distinctions of the different tools in a moment, but Truffle itself had 1.5 million downloads. We've had 1.5 million downloads as of last week. Cool. So to jump into Truffle, I know it's a bit, I'll probably confuse myself there as I've been saying it, but Truffle is one of the tools, and it was the first tool, and it's kind of the umbrella term for the framework, or Truffle framework, but it's actually kind of 3 tools with some additional things as well. So Truffle as one of the individual tools we'll go through now. So it's written in JavaScript, Node.js. It's a command line tool. So it does take, if you are new to the space or don't have a deep development background, there'll be a little bit of a learning curve for starting to use it. But assuming you have been comfortable with command line tools and and so on, then it'd be pretty straightforward. But really, it's focused on reducing the complexity of building decentralized apps or dApps. Everything from the compilation to the testing to the migration. And on the right hand side of this slide, you can see kind of all the commands that Truffle comprises of. And it's currently at version 5.0, so it's pretty mature. It's been around for a good number of years. I'm not sure when the first commit was, but a little kind of side note or anecdote, I remember starting to play with some Ethereum development or decentralized app development probably towards the end of probably around November 2015. And my goodness, I mean, I think Truffle was probably getting started back then, but I didn't know about it and certainly wasn't using it. And the super cumbersome to do kind of anything. Ethereum, there was docs out there. They were pretty patchy. And then I kind of dipped out a little bit for a while, and then came back, and then I stumbled across Truffle, and it really did make huge difference. I'm not trying to oversell it, of course, but it's really does fill in a lot of blanks in terms of building dApps. So just kind of in use, and again, this is pretty intro level. Once you've got it installed, you can just start to kind of fire off commands, everything to kind of create, initialize a project, add assets to that project. Of course, you can do that through the IDE itself if you want to add some Solidity files or whatever language you might be using. Then obviously the compilation, and it will spit out meaningful error messages, etc. Debugging, you can kind of step through the the logic of your contract and kind of interrogate current state, etc. It's a pretty powerful debugger. And then obviously the final step, that's very whirlwind. Typically take a bit longer than that, but then you're ready to migrate it to either a testnet, a mainnet, or Kaleido, or whatever it might be. And of course, just migrating it locally as well. So you would be using that command pretty soon as part of the workflow. Kind of a side note, this is kind of a super useful thing. And again, if you've been using Truffle, you've probably used some of these in the past. We have this thing called Truffle boxes. I'm not sure if the exact number that we have at the moment, but basically what they are is kind of boilerplates or templates of everything from just sample smart contracts, sample libraries, views, etc., right through to kind of complete example decentralized apps where the full code for all the kind of components or pieces of it are there. So awesome resource for both learning, learning and getting more deeper into this space if you're new to it, and kind of kickstarting projects. And kind of from this left to right on the screens here, so we have a bunch of kind of officially supported ones by us as Truffle. We also have some partner ones. So that screen, that example box in the middle is, and they have Microsoft have put a bunch more than this for Azure. So for building for the Azure blockchain workbench, and they're not just hello blockchain, but they have a bunch of more kind of real world examples. Then on the kind of right there is just an example of one of the community boxes. So I'd say there's a ton of all these awesome community boxes that folks out there have kind of built and just put up as a box. So all of which just as I said is a great resource for kind of learning and getting deeper and more familiar with this space. Cool. So that in a very, very brief nutshell was Truffle itself, and we'll see a little more when we get to the demo in a moment. But Ganache. So Ganache is another piece of the puzzle. So this is actually just like kind of local blockchain. So rather before you actually get to the point of pushing up anything to either a testnet or Kaleido or any of the things that Ben mentioned earlier, you obviously want to start building and working with that locally. It can be done fully offline, and so as I mentioned there, instant Ethereum network for both development and test. It comes in two flavors. Both a UI version, which we'll look at a screenshot of which in a moment, and a command line version, which was kind of the genesis of it, formerly named something called Test RPC. And some really nice things that have come in Ganache version 2. We'll see a screenshot but in a moment, and a little more during the demo, where you can actually kind of visually explore contract state, events, transactions, and so on, and kind of click into things that you've migrated to, again, all locally at this point. So really, really powerful as a way to just get ever increasingly familiar with this stuff if you are kind of new to it and just starting out. And there's a screenshot of Ganache. When you open it, it creates 10, and again, all of this is kind of dummy, fictitious stuff, of course, but it creates 10 accounts, each loaded with 100 Ether. And then you can see along the top there the different kind of sections of Ganache where you can see the blocks as they're mined, see the transactions as they sent in, see the, as of 2.0, actually see the contracts and interrogate all the things that we just mentioned, see events, etc. So really, really useful tool, and a no-brainer as a place to start with if you're just familiar, just starting out in this space, as I mentioned. So DRIZZLE, kind of final piece of chocolate or thing under the Truffle framework or Truffle suite. And DRIZZLE is a React.js based component library or UI library for building the kind of web interfaces for your dApps or decentralized apps. It's kind of the newest piece of the Truffle suite, and kind of rapidly evolving. But what it does do is just takes care of the synchronization of of your contract state, the transactions, etc., synchronizing them down to the browser. It's reactive, so if things change, you don't have to kind of requery it to get it an update. It just it's the magic of React as as an underpinning or dependent library there, and everything all the data that I mentioned is synchronized down to a Redux store, so really easy to kind of work with. And this is just an example screenshot of the UI that you might build. Obviously, it's more of like Hello World style or to do. It's a little bit beyond Hello World, but you can just see it as an example of things you can build with DRIZZLE. Cool. So with that, I'll briefly hand back to Ben, just to kind of touch on some of our support, both current and upcoming support for enterprise built into Truffle right now.
Yeah, so Truffle for Enterprise, fortunately, Truffle for Enterprise is shaping up to look pretty much like Truffle for MAINNET. So the development experience that we're providing for the various blockchains and distributed ledger technologies that we're supporting, basically it all boils down to a little bit of configuration that you change in your project level configuration file, and then everything else pretty much stays the same. You develop, test, migrate, all of that good stuff, just like you always would. In the case of distributed ledger technologies, which actually use the underlying EVM, the same EVM, of course, that powers Ethereum, we also allow you to do your initial development work on Ganache, so you can fire up your automated testing and all of that through Ganache. You can use the awesome Ganache 2.0 super contextual information that we have in there, we call it less hex, more text. So all of that is totally still applicable for you if you're working on one of these chains, one of these distributed ledgers that supports the EVM. So there are a few distributed ledgers out there that don't have EVM support. I think Corda is really the only one on this list that, as far as I'm aware, has no option for EVM support. So even in the case of Hyperledger Fabric, they're working on chain code right now, which actually includes an EVM and allows you to deploy Solidity smart contracts out onto Hyperledger Fabric. So really all of these are, they're moving toward the EVM, again, with the exception of Corda. So as far as support goes, we're working on support for pretty much the entire list here. Quorum support in particular is going to be out in the next release or two. We had some early Quorum support prior to Truffle 5 that it worked with kind of the sort of very basic mainline cases, but didn't support things like private transactions and that sort of stuff. So we're improving our support there pretty drastically. As far as Hyperledger Fabric and Sawtooth go, we have some beta integrations with them that are out there. Feel free to reach out if you need, if you want to get access to those. And Pantheon is great. Pantheon basically tests against Truffle out of the box. So if you're using Pantheon, nothing really you need to do. Just use Pantheon and Truffle and enjoy life. Axe Core, there's going to be an integration coming out soon with them, and Corda is going to be a slightly longer term target for us, but we're still expecting to release support for that this year. So definitely also, if as far as prompts for feedback go, if you're interested in seeing any deeper dives on our support for any one of these ledgers, include that detail in your feedback. We'd love to provide additional training and make sure that we're supporting the ledgers that you all care about the most. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Ben. So I'm just conscious of time. So as mentioned, we've got a demo. This is going to be a pretty lightweight demo for now, at least. What we'll do is create a new project. And again, it's just flattened down at screens. So just to set your expectations appropriately, won't be kind of doing it live from my desktop, at least in this webinar. But we'll see what it takes to create a new project, open it in GANACHE. We've already seen a few of those screens already, but we'll kind of dive a little bit deeper. And then we'll actually just create an example consortium network on Kaleido. So it'll be 3 nodes, kind of simulating a supply chain kind of provenance style scenario. And then we'll just see what it kind of takes to migrate your project to that, or your contracts to that, and then send a transaction. And I put just here as a kind of additional bullet, like a deeper dive coming on this soon. So this obviously is a pretty, high-level demo. We'll go through it pretty rapidly in the interest of time, but we'll almost certainly do a deeper dive on this. And as Ben mentioned, we'd love feedback on other things that you'd love to see, and we'll definitely be doing webinars around those. We'd love to do webinars around those. So as we kind of just kind of re-summarize, what it would take to create a project, just Truffle init, done. It creates and we'll see in the next screen what it writes to disk at that point. And then you can either add assets using the create command, or add tests or contracts. Of course, you can do that in the IDE of equally easily, if not easier. Or if you want to use a box, the command for unboxing a box is truffle unbox, and then the name of the box. So you can see that if you go to truffleframework.com/boxes, and all the steps are there for doing it as well. But it's literally from the command line, at least it's just that, and then it will pull down all the entire project and kind of set it up as needed, because some of them have a bit of additional kind of configuration, but it does most of that automatically. After an init and adding a contract, this is what you'll see in your local file system. We have kind of conventions baked into it. So there's a contracts directory where you put your smart contract files, Solidity, Viper, etc. There's a migrations directory that stores the kind of logic for actually what you're choosing to migrate up to whatever network you've configured in the Truffle config file. Another directory for tests, or test singular, but that's where you store your tests that you're going to run against everything. And then obviously just usual kind of Node.js package file in there as well. So that's kind of really a minimalist, empty style thing, but that's kind of what you get off the bat. At that point, if you wanted to then open it in GANACHE, so we saw a screenshot earlier of kind of a vanilla GANACHE instance just opened, and you see the 10 accounts it created. If you want to actually kind of load that project that you've just created into GANACHE, what you do is just go, from upon first load, it would say open workspace or create workspace. Just drill into the config file, open it, and then save workspace. And then you actually can see the project directly in here. So you could actually drill into the contract itself, as we were kind of alluding to earlier, see the address that's been created for, you know, the, because you'd have had to have I didn't show this step, but you'd obviously have to have migrated the contract to it in the same vein that you would do it to anywhere. You can see the state, see any transactions that are executed against that contract, events, and so on. So really, really nice in terms of, you know, visually seeing this. So it really does kind of like lessen the learning curve a little bit, at least for some of this stuff. So anyway, back to the kind of demo, caveat that it's a little lightweight. We've created a kind of very simple project. We've obviously put in some, you know, created a simple smart contract. We've migrated that at least to GANACHE locally now. We've perhaps started to play around with it. We might have tested it, debugged it, etc. And at that point, we're ready to push it up to say Kaleido, and we want to now perhaps test it in, you know, with some other parties. So this is Kaleido's kind of initial UX. One thing that's awesome about Kaleido is they have a great free tier as well, so you can literally just get started with this without even having to put your credit card in. As Ben mentioned, I think, you know, the Heroku analogy is pretty spot on, because they've really done an awesome job of, you know, making the UX, you know, really, really user friendly. And not scary at all. So if you're new to this, it's kind of like, cool, this is, I feel like I can do this. So there's, you know, a few things that you would go through. They have some awesome tutorials as well, so you can kind of go through and follow along from Kaleido's side to set some of this stuff up. So you can add nodes to the network. You know, in this case, it's, you know, it's like an example consortium network. This would be a supplier node or a supplier organization. Now, assuming we've done that 3 times, we've got 3 different nodes, each owned by a different piece of the consortium. So the suppliers, the shippers, the retailers. What you also get kind of for free within Kaleido is a built-in block explorer, a pool of ether that you can distribute to the different participants on the network. Obviously, there's obviously stuff around credentials and, you know, making sure, you know, adding different organizations so they set up their own secrets and so on. So, you know, no one member of the organization has, you know, full control over everything. Otherwise, it's not really a consortium network. So yeah, really, really simple. And then you can you know, see that we've set up an example here. And at this point, if we want to then migrate it to you know, the consortium network, it's all, you know, I didn't really look at this command earlier. And again, apologies for the speed with which we're going through this. We use Truffle migrate. So we've, and you actually specify the name of the network as an additional parameter. In this case, it's supplier node. All of the configuration and details for, you know, for in this case, Kaleido would be in the Truffle config file. The reset command kind of just resets state and rather, you know, and will allow you to kind of redeploy everything, I should say. And then this is the output that gets spat out. And then let's say that that's made it up to Kaleido. It usually takes, you know, a few minutes or a bit less, you know, 10, 15 seconds, whatever. And then you can actually drill in and see the blocks that are, you know, as they're created, transactions as they're executed from the block explorer, similar to Etherscan and others if you've used them on MAINNET or testnets. And you can also drill in and see the actual smart contracts themselves and all the transactions that have been, you know, run against them and so on. So really, really nice, you know, and a great UX for doing that. And then finally, and again, apologies for this, the speed with which we've gone through this. Let's say we want to kind of send a transaction there. So this is just a blob of JavaScript that's making a call. It's using the Truffle artifacts and requiring simple storage, which was the contract that we used, I think. I mean, this was a bit cobbled together, this one. Then we just want to execute that. Again, you can do that using the exec command. Of course, you could then, which we didn't see in this, build, you know, web user interface and, you know, use MetaMask to execute the transaction or sign the transaction and so on. And then, yeah, so essentially running this would choose, you know, specify to execute this against the supplier node. This was the reference to this file above. And you can see that in this case, it's setting the value to 65. And then you can see the transaction hash and then done. Cool. So again, that was super quick. I'm very conscious of that. So it really was just to kind of give you a flavor of the different steps that you would go through. And as mentioned, we will definitely be doing deeper dives on this in upcoming webinars. Cool. So in terms of kind of learning more and next steps, to learn more, we started these, mentioned a few of these already, of course, Truffle boxes. We also have tons of tutorials on our site as well to get started with all things related to Truffle. So this is the kind of unfurling of what the impact stack is. Basically a collection of different, you know, players in this space. So Infura, MetaMask, Pegasus, who create Pantheon. Pantheon who create Pegasus. I think that should actually be Pantheon. Alethio, Kaleido, and Truffle. So I won't because in the interest of time, expand on any of those, but they're great things to look at in projects or companies to look at in their own right with their respective services and tools. Also, have a dig into the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance.
The emails.
Yeah, dig into the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. This is a consortium in the perhaps more traditional sense, or an organization who is kind of driving, standardization, specifications, interoperability, certification programs, etc. So if you haven't heard of it and dug into it, and then this is just some of the members of the EEA along the bottom there. Cool. And then in terms of kind of next steps, feel free to reach out anytime. So I put my email address up there. It's Kevin@Truffle Framework. If you want to, I can loop in Ben or any of the folks on the team as needed. We also, if you're interested in, talking further about either training, support, exploring out building solutions, these are things we're starting to offer as a company. So, love to speak to you guys about that. We also have an event section on our website. There's only a couple of events up there now, but as mentioned, that's where we'll be listing upcoming webinars and in-person events and so on. We also have TruffleCon, which is our yearly conference. This will be the second one, August 2nd to 4th. I think that's the right dates, at Microsoft headquarters over in Seattle. There's detail. You can register your interest there. We don't have the actual registration up there for it yet. Also, if you're not on it already, sign up for our newsletter. You can do it directly from our homepage. Just kind of scroll halfway down the page and you'll see the registration form. And then, as mentioned, finally, look out for the feedback email on this. We'd love feedback. We're obviously quite aware that this was kind of intro level, and we will be doing more technical, deeper dives, in upcoming webinars. But what we'd also love to do, as mentioned, is hear about the topics you'd love to hear about from us. So definitely let us know. We'd love to hear. Cool. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for sticking with us to the end. We overran, I think, slightly. Hopefully it was worth it if you're still here. I guess if there are any questions, we'll be able to see them in the chat, so we can kind of answer them now. But as mentioned, I'll jump back to here. So if if we're a bit cut short or you don't have a question after the fact, feel free to ping me here, and then we can take it offline. So with that, yeah, thanks again. And then Jeff, I don't know if any questions have come through. And give you a moment to kind of perhaps.
Yeah. There's a question actually about testing with Python. I guess I'll just go ahead and answer that in the chat here. So I can't give any timeline for this, but we are actively working on making our test suite, or our testing capabilities, a lot more language agnostic. We actually want to make Truffle as a whole a lot more language agnostic as well. So you can see that today in Truffle 5, for instance, in our support with our support of the Viper language. Actually, the people behind the EWASM project, if you've heard of that, that's the Ethereum 2.0 project to actually make the new version of Ethereum support WebAssembly. The people who are working on that project are actually using Truffle to build Rust code for EWASM, the new EWASM target. So language agnosticity is definitely a high priority for us, but unfortunately we have a lot of high priorities right now, so we're working on a bunch of different things in tandem. So definitely keep an eye out. If you're looking for being able to write tests in another language, I think that's a feature you'll certainly see sometime in the next year or so.
Awesome. Cool. So if there's no other questions, we can wrap up now. If you do have a burning question or a question that comes after, after the fact, as mentioned, reach out. Email address is up there. Otherwise, thanks for attending, and thank you to Ben for your sections too.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you all.
See you all soon. Bye-bye.
Take care.